Hello and welcome to Apologetics for All. Today we're going to be talking about Genesis 4, continuing our discussion from Genesis 3. Genesis 4 is a very interesting story. It is indeed a story of Cain and Abel, and I hope you enjoy this discussion as we go in. And we're joined with Warren, who is going to talk about Genesis 4 with us, and hopefully it is going to be very profound and insightful for you all. So without further ado, let's get right into this discussion. How are you, Warren?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How do you think about Cain and Abel, and what role do you think it plays in with the broader narrative of the Bible and also kind of our daily lives?
That's a very deep question. I think Cain and Abel is the first story after Adam and Eve gets banished out of Eden. So it's almost the real start of humanity, I think, and it's a very gruesome start and perhaps rather pessimistic view of human nature, whilst at the same time being something that can provide us hope and insight into the human condition. Especially, I think that the analysis of Cain and Abel can take us to what Nietzsche deemed ressentiment or resentment as this profoundly human and profoundly pathological emotion that haunts us all.
I think that's a very valuable insight, and I think that's something we can develop as we're going through this video. There's a few themes that you have raised which are very interesting, and while we're getting into these themes, let's start reading the Bible, and you can flag to me when you come up with a theme or one of these themes, and I'll also stop wherever I think there's something apropos to talk about. So it says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruit of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. So what do you think about these first parts of this discussion?
Well, just first something that's slightly unrelated to the entire narrative. I find the phrase "made love" very, very interesting. As in, it does point to something profoundly important in sex. As in, it's not only a kind of copulation between beasts, but there's a certain love going on. So it's when we first get out of Eden that Adam and Eve are able to love each other. I'm not as familiar with the Bible as you, but does it mention made love before in Genesis 1, 2, or 3?
I do not think so. For in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, there is indeed no reference to any sexual relations between the two. For in Genesis 1 is the creation, Genesis 2 is also the creation, and the creation of Eve out of man, but that was not related to any making love to one another.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like love was created after the fall, and perhaps this links well back to our discussion in Genesis 3 of how the fall itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is the fall that constitutes the human being and all of the wonderful things and terrible things that occur to us, as we shall see later in the narrative.
I think that's a very interesting point, and while I do find the idea of love only occurring after the fall perhaps a bit questionable, I do think that on the other hand, I do think that there is some sense of love is only fully realized after they ate from the tree, or the fall made them fully realize the depth of love via the fact that while God loved Adam and Eve before, Adam and Eve only realized the love of God after the fall, or actually fully appreciated love, and love became appreciated instead of love began to exist after the fall. Mm-hmm. Though I do think that you raise an interesting point about the importance of love within sex, because I think commonly in society these days, we've slowly gone from an area where love is predominantly based on marriage and based on a union of love to one which has become more of an exchange or or something which is diminished away from sex to something which is more carnal or physical. I think that this change is greatly unfortunate, and perhaps and definitely I think we can perhaps delve into this idea a bit more here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would disagree with you though about
Mm-hmm.
the point that there was love before the fall, because in my view, it was the fall of this not listening to God that shows the kind of interiority, or the kind of darkness of human consciousness, the darkness in a sense that other people cannot penetrate it, and it's completely unpredictable, and you have a certain, I guess, inaccessibility towards other people. And for me, it is constitutive of love that this has to be the case. As in, when you love someone else, it's always, in Kierkegaardian terms, a leap or a certain gamble, because when you love someone else, you don't actually know how they will respond, and it is taking this risk that is constitutive of love. Therefore, in the intransparency of the human mind, that is, I guess, constituted by the fall, is love possible? Well, if we're completely transparent, then I don't think a kind of playfulness or this dance in courtship can ever happen and develop into love.
Well, I think that what we're talking about here is the difference between understanding love and love existing. Because I do agree with you that love, you might require love, you might require this fall in order to understand the gravity or the significance of love. Though I would at the same time maintain that love is indeed existent before the fall, because I think God did indeed love Adam and Eve before all the fall happened. And being omniscient, he wouldn't indeed need a fall to perhaps contextualize it in the same way that Adam and Eve perhaps required love. So I think that that's perhaps a bit more of a minor point, though I think that the takeaway from both of our interpretations is still the same, that you perhaps need this kind of fall, or you do need this kind of impurity in order to understand the beauty of love all the same. And I don't want to get caught up too much on this kind of distinction, though I think that we can perhaps delve into a bit more. And I know you do have thoughts about the idea that making love, or at least sex and love, are deeply intertwined, and when you separate it, it can lead to perhaps rather unfortunate outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I find is the kind of great danger for a human being is an inability to love. As Dostoevsky said, as you know very well, hell is an inability to love. Actually, you introduced this quote to me. So I guess what I find very, very, very horrifying is a kind of commodification of sex, which leads to a commodification of love that almost destroys what makes us absolutely human. Because, of course, love is very difficult, and it contains a lot of suffering. That's why we say we fall into love. It's this, and it's very interesting too. If we think about the phrase "falling into love" with the fall in the Bible, love, there's this sort of fall, this mistake, or this misstep is constitutive of love, but a lot of times we try to avoid it, or we try to be too safe within it, and that's what I think that's the kind of whole consent situation that's going on. As in, it's not bad to have consent, but the problem is, I think in a lot of Scandinavian countries, they're thinking about this legislation where you have like an entire sheet, and then you have to tick before you have sex. Like everything is like, okay, you even have to specify your religion and stuff, and nationality, because you can retroactively rape a person if, for example, you lie to them that, I don't know, you're a Christian. If they don't want to sleep with a Christian and they find out later on, then you can be prosecuted for raping them because you've lied to her that you're a Christian. And what I find is that there's a certain commodification in this, and also a fear of another person getting too close to you that is constitutive of this sense of consent. Although, of course, there's a lot of terrible people in the world, and you have to protect yourself against them. But nevertheless, this kind of procedure destroys something very important in love.
I think that is definitely very true and very interesting. And I think the necessary question here is, well, what do you think is the telos, the purpose of sex? Is it, I mean, in the animal world, it's mainly for procreation, though in humans, what we see is that it's become something which is way more. And there's a fine line which we see now. It's kind of like previously in the animal world, it's purely for procreation. But now we're moving towards away from from procreation to a sense of pleasure. And then now it seems that we've gone from sex as pleasure to sex as almost a commodity or an exchange between people, especially in like kind of friends with benefits or something along those lines. It's like it goes beyond merely just pleasure anymore. It's just purely about an exchange, and of course you can say that exchange is an exchange of pleasure, and of course there's that kind of intertwinement, but slowly but steadily we seem to be viewing it as just a random exchange of money or the same kind of exchange, which I think takes away from it. So what would you view sex to be? What do you think is the purpose of it?
I think a pure commodification of it wouldn't be a problem in itself, because in everyday life we do a lot of things for commodities. Like commodification isn't bad in itself. The problem with a kind of commodification of sex is that you can't separate sex, I think, or separate something so intimate from what constitutes you as a person. And once commodified, you're almost doing damage to yourself or to your humanity by commodifying sex, because you said that one of the telos of sex in the animal world, at least, is procreation. But precisely because we're not, I think sex precisely constitutes the dimension in which we're not so animal, as in we don't only have sex for procreative means, but instead a lot of times we have sex. I think you can find a lot of historical examples for this that jeopardizes actually our I guess evolutionary survival probability. And in this sense, this blind irrationality in sex is what makes us human. And if you commodify it and rationalize it, then you almost destroys this dimension. And I find it very, very terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And tying this back into Adam and Eve, you can see that the first thing that we do after we become human in a proper sense is to make love, and therefore the Bible is basically saying that, well, this is something extremely, extremely, extremely important, and something that we cannot, something whose weight we cannot underestimate.
Mm-hmm. I think that this discussion definitely is, what you say is very interesting, and I think it also ties in, I don't want to dwell on sex too much here, but I think it definitely ties in on with the idea that sex is there in a bondage in a matrimony or in a marriage. And that might be a very interesting way, and we might discuss this idea of sex in future videos. Though the reason I was smiling just now is because I created or thought of a very interesting a title, which was Teenagers Discuss Sex. And I think that might get a lot of views. And then I'll put a picture of like a rather risque picture on it. But I mean,
maybe like I don't know, like two virgins discussing sex. Well, yes. I cannot claim. I don't know whether you're a virgin though, and I don't know whether I'm a virgin. So
thou shalt not commit adultery in the mind. But let us progress on, and I think that our discussion on made love was very fruitful. But perhaps we can go on and talk a bit more about ressentiment or resentment, because it is indeed found here in this distinction that we see right here. I think it's like, well, so Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. And I think that is quite a clear reference to the Nietzschean idea of ressentiment.
Mm-hmm. And it almost reminds me of what God is saying here. It almost reminds me of Nietzsche's, I guess, dictum of this kind of radical acceptance of responsibility and this love for your fate and whatever happens to you. Because it does seem that perhaps Cain has some reason to feel resentful towards God, because at least the Bible does not indicate where he did wrong. But this almost seems to be a certain capriciousness that is involved in this differential, I guess, treatment between Cain and Abel. But what is wrong, and what Cain does wrong, is that he allows this, I guess, resentment towards these inequalities to take over him, and that is the real danger. Because of course life is unequal, and everyone has their fortunes and misfortunes. The only thing that one can do to avoid this resentment is to love fate, or to embrace the world in its, I guess, flaws.
I think that's a very interesting point to discuss, though I think that there is indeed at least some sense of reference to an idea that while Cain's sacrifice to God wasn't exactly bad, it wasn't the best, because I think that this raises a very fundamental question. And this is what we see in verse 3. In the course of the time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn. We can see that Abel is giving the best, whereas Cain is giving something which is average. And while given something average is not exactly horribly wrong, it still isn't good as Abel. And I think this raises an interesting discussion of, well, and I'll go back to your point of personal responsibility later in a bit, but I think this raises a very immediate discussion of, well, are we living to do good, or are we living to avoid evil? Because if they didn't bring the offering, then they would be doing evil. But they did bring the offering, so they're avoiding evil. But then on Abel's side, he's living to do good by giving the best to God. That is a good act. Whereas Cain, in trying to just avoid doing evil by bringing in a random group of offering, is then no longer trying to live to do good, but just living to avoid evil. And as a result, it is less satisfying or less fulfilling by just trying to avoid evil wherever it comes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that... Go ahead.
It almost feels to me that precisely because Cain did not give his best offering, give his best sacrifice to God, that he would develop this kind of resentment. Because the best way to fend off resentment towards fortune is just to sacrifice as much as you can, it seems to me, and take what one receives. So it's almost as if Cain's resentment stems out of the fact that he, in some sense, really deserved it, he didn't deserve the praise as much as Abel, and therefore Abel was praised more than Cain. And it is precisely when you get what you deserve, and you know that you've actually done something wrong, that you feel terrible. It's the same as, I would play cards with my parents, and we would gamble some money, right? And then the worst feeling is not that you have like bad luck, I don't know, the entire hour, and then you just lose everything. But when you have relatively good luck, but you just mess up some of the plays, and then you end up losing terribly. There's a qualitative difference between the two. For one, it's like I've tried my best, and I can equanimically accept fate. But for the other one, it's kind of, why the hell did I do this? And then you project your anger towards yourself into the world in the form of a resentment. So that's the kind of Peterson statement, I think, of how Hitler's resentment was almost a kind of wanting to kill himself through this, provoking the entire Europe into flames. It's the same with Abel. It's almost a punishment towards himself, a hatred towards himself that leads to his murder of Abel, to anticipate the story later on.
I think that's a very interesting point, and I think that this perfectly ties into our idea of ressentiment, in the sense that, and the taking of responsibility, in the sense that our anger towards God, or at least Cain's anger towards God, is a representation of him trying to avoid taking on individual responsibility. And that's something we discussed previously in when we discussed the role of what were we discussing? When we discussed one of our friends being very angry when they only slept 5 hours a night. They were really angry at everything else because, well, they were gaming till 3 a.m. and then they slept for like 5 hours until 8 or something along those lines. and they're really angry that they slept very little, when in reality, the only person they could blame is themselves, because who told them to game until like 3 a.m. in the morning? And in the same way, I think that some sense of Cain is indeed applicable to this situation where he is resenting the situation, even though he subconsciously knows that it's completely his fault of not being good enough in the situation.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that actually reminds me of Hayek's comment on capitalism, right? So some people's like telling Hayek, well, a lot of times capitalism doesn't seem fair, and because it is capricious in times, and some bad people get lucky, some hardworking people get bad luck, gets like, I don't know, impacted by economic crises. And then, Hayek, how do you respond to that? And what he said, I don't know, this seems quite cynical, but I think it's apropos here, that it is precisely because of this contingency of capitalism that allows it to work. And then because it is so damn contingent, whenever you fail, you feel like you don't actually fail yourself, but it is a system that has failed you. So you wouldn't go full resentment towards the world, but have this moderate resentment. I guess your resentment would be moderated and not full-fledged, precisely because you sense the inadequacy of the system.
I think that's a very interesting thing, though in that such of a critique, you'll perhaps be saying that, well, that the flaw of the system is what makes it beautiful, or something along those lines. And I don't necessarily think that that's the case with capitalism, though you could obviously say, of course, every economic system has its flaws. But perhaps you could say at the same time that there is, or at least with the case of Cain, is that it is really, truly, completely his own doing, instead of there actually is flaws of the system. It's like, well, who told him not to bring in the first fruits of the harvest or whatever and give it to God? So there is a bit of a difference over there as well, I think. Mm-hmm.
But I think the more interesting reading is that there is a certain sense of arbitrariness to the whole thing, but also a sense of his own doing. And you can't say that it is completely his fault, but you can't say that he's faultless. And I think that would be the most interesting reading. And it is these two combined together that leads to the absolute resentment.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very interesting thing, and you've made me raise a question, and I'm not necessarily saying that we must answer in this discussion, but would a god be good if you purposely did something unfairly to someone, knowing that allowing something unfair to happen would allow for, or at least allow for the potential for further development? Would that be a good god who did that? And it's not something I'm trying to answer here, but just something to think about.
I don't think so, at least from my own ethical beliefs, because I've become, as you know, a very strict Kantian. So I don't think, I think for our normal day life, we can do utilitarian calculations, like this is better perhaps for the long run, that is not so good, so we can do this. But for a god who tries who is moral perfection, we cannot allow anything like that to happen, or he cannot allow anything like that to happen. Instead, every single act that he does have to be good in and for itself. So the form must be good, irrespective of the content. And without that, I don't think it would. I don't think he can be called a benevolent god.
And in that question, though, if we use that understanding, then how does it tie into the text if we were to interpret it as there's some sense of arbitrariness in the situation of God? I mean, I can see a few ways out of it, but I would just like to question you on this situation. Well, how do you think that reading would imply or relate with the discussion we see in the text here?
Yeah, because for me, I'm not so committed to the idea that God is all powerful, all benevolent, or omniscient, and all the traditional qualities. Instead, I think I would anthropomorphize God a lot and say, well, indeed, there is some arbitrariness to his decisions, and that is just life. But nevertheless, one should still love him despite perhaps sometimes the unfairness that happens in life. And that is true love. True love is not loving something that has to be loved, absolutely. But true love is to love something that has some flaws. I don't think this is a very Christian interpretation, but
I think there's a way in which we could develop your idea to make it more Christian. And it's something that I've been wrestling with recently. It's the idea that we shouldn't define God as any of these categories. We know he's greatly loved and we know he's greatly good. But, well, to what extent do we mean when we say omni is a very big question, because it's very easy for us to say, well, something is omnipotent. And, well, we could ask, well, what does it mean to be omnipotent? Then someone could say, well, he's infinitely powerful. But then the natural question then arises, like, well, what do you mean by infinitely powerful? Do you mean by like Aleph numbers, or do you mean by infinite as in like real numbers, or infinite as in like some subjective understanding of the infinite? And immediately these problems arise. So I think that there is a very big question as to what do we mean when we say God is omnipotent or omnibenevolent, to the degree that it can't actually really be answered in any significant or substantive way. We have good reason, and this is my approach to God, we have good reason to believe that something along those lines exists. We have good reason to believe that something along those lines demonstrates a property along which is greatly loving, which is greatly knowledgeable, but we still don't have that direct category to say, well, that's just infinitely powerful, that's infinitely loving. That is perhaps, to me, a step too far, in the sense that we just don't exactly know the quality of being infinitely good and infinitely loving, such that we shouldn't be using these qualities to categorize God. Though, however, you can look... Go ahead.
Yeah. First, I'm wondering whether those categories came from the Bible directly, or at least to my knowledge, it's later theologians who kind of impose these onto it. So I don't think sometimes perhaps it's not very appropriate for one to speak about a biblical God in those three omni terms, even though it's been kind of inculcated into us since, I don't know, like year 6. But because they almost portray a very deep metaphysical prejudice about the nature of the world by using these terms. And at the same time, I think you'll be very interested in one of Levinas's books called Totality and Infinity, where he precisely analyzes the idea of the infinite and the idea of the God as infinite in relation to Descartes' discussion in his proof of God's existence in the first meditation. Not first meditations, I don't know, like fourth or third meditations, where he said that, well, I have this idea of the infinite, and I feel my imperfection compared to this infinite. The idea of the infinite cannot be contained within me. It must stem from some infinite being, because the cause must be as great as the effect. Therefore, God must exist. And what we mean by the infinite here is something almost overflowing, or something that cannot be completely exhausted in a human being. So something that cannot be comprehended. And that's what the infinite means, in contrast with a kind of infinite that is static. It's a dynamic infinite that it's always growing, always pushing out. And I feel like you can even say that in a genuine relationship with some other person, whether friendship or love, you're encountering God in the sense that you're encountering the infinite. Because in a genuine relationship, what you feel is the inexhaustibility of the other person and themselves as an end rather than as a means. So for me, at least in my theology, it's almost like God is not something high above the sky, but materializes. It's not materializes, but manifests itself in our everyday relationships with another person, in this feeling of infinity when we genuinely encounter someone else.
I think this view is very interesting. I think that the usage of that form of infinity is the best way to describe God, because I think it's too difficult, or at least too impossible, to describe any of these qualitative senses. And that's something I've been critiquing very recently. It's like, I don't necessarily think that we can label God as omnibenevolent or omnipotent or omnipresent, because we don't actually fully understand what on earth these terms actually mean. Though we do know that the best way to understand the properties of God is by feeling, and your idea of love is so appropriate here, because there is a verse in the Bible which says we love because he first loved us. We understand that experience because of God's love, and by loving others, we are experiencing the love of God within us. Though I do think that we have to have a very kind of careful usage of this idea that God is is felt within the love before we accidentally turn into a bit of more of a Berkeleyan sense of God is the world, or God is literally in the world. We're touching, we're feeling, we're experiencing all this God, and we're like, well, alas,
touching
yes.
God in his infinity.
Yes, exactly. Then I think that's such categorization would then be very dangerous. So I think that I definitely agree with your kind of the idea of the inability or the impossibility to quantify God in the way we were taught via custom. But of course, there is definitely some restrictions to it, unless we go completely on the other side and we're touching the infinity everywhere. Then I wouldn't be able to say that I'm touching Warren in his infinity. That might not work very well. Though and at this point, I think it is best for us to move on, perhaps, to the next section of the discussion, where it says, well, where the sin is committed, the crime is committed, where it is indeed written, well, now Cain said to his brother, let us go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? Is there anything interesting in this point that you would like to discuss?
It seems like a complete repetition of what I think it was Adam, of what Adam said to God after they ate the apple. Like it's an exact repeat of the impulse to lie and to hide one's crimes that we see repeated, and it's again it seems almost constitutive of humanity that we have this direct impulse to try to cheat the divine, or try to, it's almost like cheating our conscience or lying to ourselves, and it's a deep-seated human prejudice. I just find it extremely funny when Cain says those lines. I'm not sure whether you find it comical also.
I find it quite comical as well, because here they say, well, I've realized I'm naked, and then here it says, well, what does it say? Am I my brother's keeper? It's like, well, am I keeping my brother? Am I naked? It's like, well, I've realized I've messed up. I don't exactly want to face my reality. And I think this is a very interesting thing. It's like, and I was discussing this with my friend recently, it's that when we're pushed to the extreme in some sense, either it's you're angry at yourself, as in Cain's situation, or in my friend's situation, he was perhaps quite righteously or justifiably angry about the situation he was put into. Like, people weren't treating him the nicest way. So he was naturally going to be angry with his situation. And in the same way, although from two different situations, your anger, your great anger or an irritance about a certain situation gives you the opportunity to either do great good or the opportunity to do great evil. Abel and Cain, or Cain in these circumstances, was at this breaking point and then decided to do evil. Whereas you could be at the breaking point and then decide to do good. And that was the potential which was provided by the situation, which was not fulfilled.
Yeah, so it's almost like the existential dilemma that we have to face every single day of what do I do after I realize that I've done something wrong? Do I try to improve, or do I just let myself fall? Do I fall into resentment? To use, I guess, a very, very colloquial metaphor, analogy, we can just take the example of people failing in exams, right? There's some people who, like, once they've got, I don't know, a 50%, they work their ass off in the next next month, and then they improve their scores. But then there's another type of people who sort of, after they messed up, they just completely give up. And although I don't exactly like to measure people with exam scores, I think you can take this into the realm of Cain and Abel here. It is exactly this dilemma of whether I should accept my faults and try to improve myself and consequently the world for the better, or should I just allow myself to fall into resentment? And it really is extremely easy for us to choose the path of resentment, partly because it empties us of personal responsibility, and it makes us feel a lot more self-righteous. I feel like when You almost feel justified in this kind of resentment, whereas in this improving in yourself, you have to first admit that yes, there was something wrong. Even though I would argue, perhaps in the path of resentment, of this falling down and then not saving oneself, there's still a sense of guilt, but it's a guilt that is concretized in a self-righteousness.
I think you put out a very interesting point, and I think that we could develop on it and tie in some ideas of the Greek stories. And the idea that right before the fall, right before this choice of whether to go forward towards the good or towards the resentment or the evil, to just use a bit more like archetypal kind of a terminology here, it is right before this choice where you are the most powerful, the most terrible. And terrible not in the sense of bad, but in the sense of like the greatness kind of terrible. And you could see with Perseus, before he decides to fly up to Olympus, that's where he is the most powerful. In the same sense, Cain is the most powerful when he decides to go into the field and kill his brother Abel. He is the most angry. He is himself in the most raw form. And there's this statement where we've been given this ability to influence the world around us in our greatest state at these kind of crossroads. And that's what makes these points so important in our lives. Do we use that power that we're granted in these situations to choose to do the good? Or do we choose to do the evil as a result of it? And if you do evil, then there would be great consequences.
And I feel like these crossroads are not, does not have to be so dramatic as it's depicted inside the story. But instead, the crossroads can be very simple ones, as you just have everyday choices of, should I lie right now, or should I tell the truth? Should I do this or do that? It's these very simple situations that makes us the person and makes us who we are. And it is in these simple choices that I think that the story of Cain and Abel repeats itself. So it doesn't have to be something that is so dramatic. And I think it's something that we have to emphasize here.
I definitely agree with you on that point. And I think it is very, very interesting. And it's kind of the idea how these stories, the archetypal stories, can be applied to our daily lives in way more significant or insignificant ways, though I don't think insignificant is the right word here, because in most situations, significance is not dependent exactly on exactly the situation, but rather it is a very personal experience on multiple circumstances. Now with that in mind, I think we could go on to the consequences. We were talking a lot about the consequences of evil. Now my friend is going outside, and I'm not sure where exactly he's going, but
yeah, I'm going outside because it's a good directive for health to watch sunlight when you're near sunset. And now it is near sunset, and the sky is getting dark, so I'm coming outside to get some sunlight.
Indeed. So I think we can go to our next point, where we're talking about, well, the consequences of the evil works. I think this is where you can tie in this with Macbeth, and in the further case, Crime and Punishment. And this is where I think it is just so fascinating, the repetitive archetype of guilt, which is, the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." I think that this is such a fascinating point, and it is just so perfectly represented in here, and also is a repetitive theme in Macbeth and later on in Crime and Punishment with Raskolnikov, the guilt of great evil. Do you have any thoughts that you want to start off with?
Yeah, I find it extremely interesting that the punishment is to make Cain a wanderer, as in someone who does not have any home. And for me, you know me very well, I'm very intrigued by the concept of nostalgia, and especially in the Odyssey, as in the beginning of Western literature, is exactly this urge to return back into home. And it is this urge to return back to home that drives all of our movements. And in the same way that you can say that Odysseus in the Odyssey is a wanderer who wants to find a home. You can say that Cain is someone who found his home and who did not respect it. And his home perhaps is not only the field but also God, in the sense, I think he said something like he can't see God, or God can't see him. And it is in this that a home dwells, and it has to be constantly tilled and protected, and it is filled not by a certain geographical location, but by our own moral acts.
I think it is such an interesting concept that you're raising here. It's the idea of the lostness. And I think that this perhaps is very similar to the fall of Adam and Eve from the garden, because they were kicked out of paradise, they were kicked out of their home. In the same way, Cain is kicked out of his home, kicked out of the place that he was given, even though they're perhaps a bit different situations. And I think that I think you could build up upon it a bit more and say that, well, losing or being kicked out of your home is not all evil. In the same sense that if you look at this situation here, it says, well, when Cain says, my punishment is more than I can bear, the Lord says, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And there's this idea that, well, yes, the situation that you're granted with might not be the best situation. It might be really bad. But nevertheless, if you look at it, all our falls are made in such a way that good can still come out of it. In the same way that when Adam and Eve fell from grace, when they fell from the garden, good did indeed come out from it. In the same way, when Cain was cast out of the situation, he was punished. The ability to wonder, although it is greatly suffering, has provided Cain and provided us with new potential to do good or achieve greater profundity in the future.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say too. That there's a certain constructiveness in this wandering. It's being banished from home, because it isn't the kind of archetypal story that of the child who leaves his home into wandering in order to establish a new home that really belongs to himself, establish his own identity. And in the same way, perhaps somehow this is being banished from paradise and also banished from the field is a way for human beings to reestablish themselves in some way that I guess not necessarily independent of God, but in a way that is much more self-reliant, using Emerson's phrase. And I also find the harmony between wonder and wander very interesting. Like wonder as in the wanderer, and wander as in the wanderer. Okay, that didn't really make much sense.
So I think the better way would be wonder as in awe, and wanderer as in like the wanderer.
Wonder in the sense of wanderer, and wander in the sense of wanderer, and you can figure out which to wonder it is. And it's very related to one of my very explicit dreams that I cannot disclose to you right now, but which I've talked extensively to Josh about.
This, my friend, is indeed an interlude of laughter. Though I think we could get back to the theme of Cain and Abel, and I think you could tie it in with the Tolkien narrative that wandering itself isn't an evil thing, and sometimes it is good not just to be wandering as a result of being punished, but it's also good to be wandering as a result of your own wishes. You should go out to wander at times, even if it's not a forced wandering. For example, in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien says, "Not all that is gold glitters. Not all who wander are lost." And this is a poem talking about Aragorn. And essentially, I think what it's saying is that sometimes you have to go out into the wild to wander, to wonder while you're wandering, and you're embraced by the greatness, the awe of the world while wandering, and doing so doesn't mean you're lost. You're in full control, but you're in full control by putting yourself out of control, and I think that's a very beautiful thing.
Yeah, very a very nice quote that Adorno always likes to quote is that philosophy is a certain homelessness, a desire to be at home everywhere. And I think that's the same thing with wandering. It is this certain homelessness and this finding of a home that makes us think that creates everything great. But at the same time, I feel like you can almost interpret this banishing from his field as God's love towards Cain, despite what he has done, because God almost realized that, well, yes, Cain did this terrible thing. He murdered his brother, but I cannot give up on him. But instead, I would shove him out of his home, out of the place that he is familiar with, to let him wander, let him encounter the world, let him explore, and let him grow inside the process, and let him mature, so he can really take on responsibility. So this banishment is in itself both a punishment and a reward.
Indeed. I think that's a very interesting discussion, and something that is a very appropriate place to end this video off on. We've talked a bit about wandering, we've talked a bit about sex, we've talked a bit about basically guilt and punishment, but also potential within the punishment. I think that this is a very interesting place to end off with. Thank you for watching this video. Like always, if you want to check out more of our content, you can find it on Dostoevsky and Us, my podcast, or on Thinker's Kitchen with Warren Jew. If you enjoyed this thing and want more, make sure to like and subscribe for more uploads about these topics. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Goodbye, my friends, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a great one, my friends.